some of my friends who have joined from even Ramgarh. Bhandari Sahab, namaskar. We really envy you. You are in those cold climes up in the hills, but lovely to see you. So, very welcome to you.
Thank
And
you.
just a word about the association. This is, people say that this is a kind of a unique association of the pensioners of All India Services, IAS, IPS, and Forest Service. And it's been functioning for quite a while, of course, but we contribute and create a corpus. We don't get any funding from anywhere else. And much of our activity, in fact, mainly our activity is social service, like adopting some slum schools, etc. And one of the things we try to do is also organize these monthly lectures, which is called Jigyasa. And we have Mr. Arun Kumar, who's currently our president. He's been our president for some years now. He was formerly chief secretary. And he's a polymath who has interest in all kinds of things, gardening, photography, architecture, and
Gardening also.
IT, a variety of things. And of course, we have many of our friends. So, not taking any more of your time, I will now request him formally to commence the proceedings and introduce you formally. And then we look forward to your presentation. Sir.
Thanks, Narendra. Friends, we have today with us Dr. Aashique Iqbal from Krea University, Andhra Pradesh. I welcome Dr. Iqbal to Jigyasa, a forum of our association. A very hearty welcome to you, Dr. Iqbal. Dr. Iqbal did his MA in modern history from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He did his MPhil also in modern history from the same university. And his dissertation was Winging It, Aviation and Indian Society, 1911-1946. Dr. Iqbal obtained his DPhil in history in 2017 from the prestigious Oxford University, UK. Sovereign Skies, Aviation and the Indian State, 1939 to 1954, was the subject of his thesis. Dr. Iqbal is a scholar, writing essays, organizing and participating in various conferences on history, his special interest being aviation. He has made presentations at the International Conference on Business and Economic History at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. In 2017, he made presentations on growing pains, the expansion of Indian Air Force in World War II at the King's College, London. He made another presentation at the University of Nottingham on of Princes and Planes, Aviation in the Indian States. Dr. Iqbal has been Associate Editor, South Asian Studies, London, and Research Consultant on Provisional Semantics Project of the Imperial War Museum, London. Presently, Dr. Iqbal is Assistant Professor at Krea University, Andhra Pradesh, where he has introduced several new courses. His book, Aeroplanes and the Making of Modern India, has recently been published by the Oxford University Press. This is also the subject of today's discussion and talk. He is also working on a new book, Flights of Leisure, Air Tourism in Modern India, 1950-2000, which is expected to be out next year. We are looking forward eagerly to Dr. Iqbal's talk on a very interesting subject. Dr. Iqbal साहब कुछ रह गया आप तो माफ करिएगा.
No, sir.
Now over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, sir. And thank you, Narendra, sir, as well, for inviting me for this talk. I'll just see if I can share my screen, if possible. Please tell me if it is visible. Are you able to see my?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Okay. It's now in full screen mode.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So, so this is my book about which I'm planning to give a talk today. It's titled "The Aeroplane and the Making of Modern India." It came out last year from Oxford University Press. Before I start talking about the book itself, a wider question to be asked is, why should we care at all about aeroplanes in the history of this country? Right? It's a very legitimate question to ask. After all, the vast majority of our countrymen, even today, have never set foot in an airport, let alone in an aeroplane. Right? It's largely an elite enterprise, both by the people who flew aeroplanes, who designed them, who sort of were transported in them. But the argument which I make in my book is basically that the aeroplane actually had a very small, but nonetheless a very significant impact on the history of both India and Pakistan in the decade of their formation. In particular, my book looks at the period from 1939, which is when the Second World War started, all the way up to 1950, when India, of course, becomes a republic and aeroplanes, go on to be nationalized in 1953. So it's basically a look at that 10 to 15-year period where India emerges as an independent country and the role which the aeroplane plays in that story, as well as the ways in which aeroplanes were themselves heavily influenced by the political developments on the ground. So let's begin by talking a little bit about aviation in the years before the Second World War. Before World War II, aviation was not doing particularly well in India, at least aviation run by Indians. There was an imperial airline which was run by the British Empire, Imperial Airways, which flew from London to Sydney, and it used to sort of stop in India. But Indians themselves received very little by way of support from the colonial government, for flying aircraft or for establishing an aviation industry in India. The pioneer, of course, in certain ways of aviation in India is J.R.P. Tata. He sort of flies from Karachi to Bombay, the first airmail flight, which you can see in this image. But just as important in certain ways as GRT is, if you can see the man to his left in a topi, that is Neville Vincent, a South African sort of aviator who kind of comes to help him. To give you a sense of how
Dr. Iqbal,
yeah,
can I interrupt?
please.
If you could speak a little slowly and a little louder.
Sure. Is this better? Can you hear me?
It's
Yeah,
better,
perfect.
and maybe a little slowly.
Little slower. Okay. I have a lot of
I know,
stuff to say,
doesn't
which is
matter.
why my timer's running. But absolutely,
No. I don't think.
Yeah.
Time is
Yeah.
all right. Little flexible.
Okay, sir. Perfect. So if you look at this photo, what you see is Tata standing in front of the Portsmouth aircraft, which is the first aircraft that is used, to fly airmail by an Indian. The important thing to get a sense of how bad the aviation infrastructure in India was for Indians is that this aircraft, had to land, in near Ahmedabad for refueling, and that refueling was conducted by the Burma Shell Corporation. But the drums carrying the fuel had to be brought in a bullock cart to be put into the aeroplane. So it's quite a sort of backward ramshackle infrastructure. The infrastructure along the Imperial Air Route is really good, in the sense the parts of the air route from Sydney to London that cover India is very good. But overall, Indians receive very little by way of subsidies. The colonial government is not interested in providing a lot of support for Indian aviation on the civil side. So if that's the story on the civil side, then we have to ask ourselves, what was the story like on the military end of affairs? Well, on the military end of affairs, the story was even less promising. What we have over here in this image is, Indian Hawaii sepoys. They were not called flight sergeants like their RAF counterparts. They were called Hawaii sepoys, standing in front of an aircraft that was known as the Westland Wapiti. The Westland Wapiti was known by the British as the What a Pity aeroplane, right? It was so bad, it was so backward. Even in 1933, when the Indian Air Force was sort of, first given its first squadron, the fact of the matter is that this aeroplane was very, very ramshackle. It didn't have radios on board the aeroplane. So what the pilot often did when he wanted to communicate with ground crews was that they would carry a pigeon in a cage, on the aircraft, and they sort of fly into the air. And if news needed to be sent to the ground, he would either drop it in a sort of he would tie it to a stone and drop it down onto the ground where it would be picked up by the armed forces, or else he would send it by throwing a pigeon back. The Westland Wapiti was such a bad aircraft that it had to be pushed into place. It didn't sort of start on its own. It had to be pushed, like you've probably seen older cars, had to be pushed into place. It was an aeroplane that had to be pushed into place. It was also an aeroplane that didn't even have a seat belt for the gunner. Only the pilot. There are two guys who fly this aeroplane, a pilot and a gunner. The pilot would have a seat belt, but the gunner would be chained into place by a chain called the monkey chain, right? So this is a really terrible aircraft, and it was an aircraft that was deliberately given to the Indian Air Force because the British were not especially keen on establishing an Indian Air Force, right? One of the key ways in which the British were able to control India, especially in the 1930s, was through having a big Royal Air Force presence in India. So if Indians came into control of an Indian Air Force, then the chances for rebellion was substantial. Going back to 1857, the British had a policy of not giving their most powerful weapons to Indians. But there was also the possibility that instead of rebellion, there might be the possibility for Indian politicians to claim self-government, right? Like if India was able to self-sustainably govern its own military, then India could become like Australia or Canada. It could have self-government within the British Empire. So the British were actually not very keen to start an Indian Air Force. Initially, they only wanted to give the Indian Air Force 4 aeroplanes, but then they found that even that was going to be uneconomic. So they said that they would basically give India one squadron, and India only had one squadron. The Indian Air Force had only one squadron from 1933 all the way till 1939. So right until the Second World War, the image for aviation is really, really bad. It's really, really poor. Indians are flying ramshackle aircraft. The infrastructure on the ground is quite weak. But all of this suddenly changes overnight with the Second World War. In fact, one of my big arguments is that if not for the Second World War, Indian aviation would very likely have remained in this backward state for a very long time to come. So that's where my first sort of chapter begins. That's effectively where the story I tell begins, which is in 1939, when suddenly India is confronted by the possibility of a war. And that war is one in which the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, is not going to be fighting mainly in India. It's going to be fighting mainly in Europe and to a lesser extent in Africa. It's not going to be deployed in India. Now, you may think of this as something that might have come as a surprise to the British, but actually, Indian politicians had been making this precise argument throughout the 1930s. Throughout the 1930s, they had said that India needs to have an Indian Air Force, just like it has an Indian army, because when there is a general war, if another world war was to break out, then India would find itself abandoned. India would find itself at the tender mercies of whoever India had to fight in World War II. Now, initially, of course, the theory, both in British and nationalist circles, was that if there was going to be a war in 1939, that war was not probably going to be in the East, but that war was going to be in the West. The threat to India, of course, had always been from the Northwest Frontier Province. That is where the largest numbers of Indian Air Force aircraft, and British Air Force aircraft had been placed. But the big fear was that Russia would attack India. Right? Russia had signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany, and the British institutions in India were deeply sort of anxious about the possibility of a war with Russia. But of course, that's not what ended up happening. What ended up happening was that the situation, which was pretty dire in 1939, became even more dire in 1942 when the Japanese attacked Southeast Asia. Now, in theory, the Japanese should never have come anywhere near India's borders. They should likely have been stopped in Malaya. The big British belief was that they would be stopped at Singapore, but actually the Japanese were able, in the course of a little over a month, to fight their way all the way from Malaya and Singapore all the way into Burma. By mid 1942, Burma had fallen, and the Japanese were, for all practical purposes, on the borders of what was then the province of Assam. This meant that the British now had to completely reverse their earlier policies about keeping Indians out of the Air Force. They really needed to get a lot of Indians into the Air Force. They really needed to build up an Indian Air Force. So what they ended up doing was expanding the Indian Air Force from 1 squadron to 10 squadrons, right? That's a growth of something like 1,000% over the course of a little under 4 years. Now, this growth was, as you may have heard, I wrote a paper called I presented a paper called Growing Pains, in which I said that you can't grow an institution at such a rapid rate without causing very serious problems. And the image over here that you can see is pretty illustrative of those problems, right? So if the British needed to build aerodromes in India, they needed to mobilize millions of uneducated people, they could do so quite easily. They had done so in World War I, and they did so in World War II. In fact, they built over 400 aerodromes across India. They built meteorological stations. They built telegraph stations. But the problem was finding educated Indians who would be able and willing to serve in the Indian Air Force. And this proved to be a very, very difficult problem. Initial plans for a 15 squadron Air Force had to be sort of scaled down to a 10 squadron Air Force. So even though the Indian Air Force expanded massively during the war, in practice, this expansion was not necessarily as large as it could have been, especially if it had been begun well before the war. Now, just a couple of points here. One is that my book is not really doesn't deal very heavily with what it is the Indian Air Force did during the Second World War. The reason for this is that other people have already written quite extensively, on this subject. But just very briefly, what the Indian Air Force did during the war was that the Indian Air Force ended up performing extremely well throughout the conflict. It was especially famous for using hurricanes for tactical reconnaissance. The Indian Air Force was not used against the Japanese Air Force for a bunch of reasons, mainly because the British didn't often, even at this point, didn't often provide Indians with with the latest in terms of aircraft and with opportunities to fight the Japanese. Indians were mostly given unglamorous but dangerous duties. Nevertheless, the Indian Air Force conducted itself with a great deal of excellence. It won a number of medals, a number of Jangi Inams from the British government, and recognition for the services of the Indian Air Force were provided by the British government in the form of the title Royal. So the Royal Indian Air Force came into existence towards the end of the war. The Indian Air Force was given the title Royal Indian Air Force. This is the time of sort of several legendary sort of characters who will later go on to play a very, very important role in the history of the Indian Air Force. Men like Harjinder Singh, who will sort of rise from the lowest echelons of the Indian Air Force to become the second highest ranking officer. He becomes Air Vice Marshal of the Indian Air Force. People like M.M. Engineer, who are basically the Engineer brothers, two brothers, one of whom had earlier won a race to fly from London to India, beating G.R.D. Tata incidentally in the race. He basically will also later head the Indian Air Force later in history. So a lot of the people who will become the institution builders for the Indian Air Force will basically serve in this war. If the Indian Air Force benefited immensely from this war, civil aviation suffered quite badly, as often happens in wars. The government took a lot of the pilots who were sort of civil aviators and put them into uniform. It also took over a lot of aircraft. But as the war went on, it became clear to the British that even in wartime, you need to have a commercial air facility. You need to have the capacity to fly officers and men to various positions. So what ends up happening is that even though during the war, Indian civil aviation suffers, after the war, civil aviation actually goes through a huge boom because a lot of ex-Air Force men are going to sort of be joining commercial aviation. A lot of aeroplanes are going to be sold at very, very cheap rates. A huge number of aerodromes have been built during the war. In fact, so many aerodromes were built during the war that we have still not really reached the capacity to use those aerodromes in India at present today. We've only sort of our aviation capacities even today are not large enough to basically make full use of the infrastructure that was developed during the war. So initially, the war proves to be a curse for civil aviation, but as time passes, it becomes increasingly sort of important. But of course, this boom in civil aviation, this huge success of both the Indian Air Force as well as Indian commercial flying, uh, is put into question by the huge tragic political events that follow in 1946-47, which is when the partition of India takes place. Aeroplanes are going to play a really, really important role. But first, maybe a couple of words about the Independence Day celebrations themselves. So this, of course, is a photo of the Red Fort and the fly past over the Red Fort on 15th August 1947. The day on which sort of India, comes into existence as an independent country. What's interesting about this image is at the bottom you can probably see the Air Force. You can see Air Force personnel sort of standing over there, on parade. On top you can see all these large aeroplanes flying over. None of those aeroplanes are Indian. All of those are British aeroplanes. Those are aeroplanes of the Royal Air Force. They're four-engined, most likely Lancaster bombers. India did not have a bomber force. India's aeroplanes were largely, the Indian Air Force's aircraft were largely single-engine aeroplanes that were used mostly for tactical reconnaissance and potentially ground attacks. But one set of aeroplanes that you see over here is essentially the aeroplanes of the British flying over India on Indian Independence Day. Of course, people on the ground would be none the wiser. The other set of aircraft, and I've not been able to find an image of this, but we have some testimony that this happened, was that Indian aircraft flew over the Red Fort in a formation that's spelt Jai Hind, right? Jaihind. The Jai was made up mostly of Indian pilots, but the Hind was made up entirely of Pakistani pilots. Because the Indian Air Force, as you know, was being divided between India and Pakistan. And a lot of the pilots who were going to Pakistan were stationed in Delhi on their way to sort of transit to Karachi. So they were there on the Indian Independence Day. And nobody at that point in time felt that it was very contradictory for Pakistani pilots to fly, in this Indian Independence Day parade, partly because they had just been members of the same institution for a very long time, but also partly because there was a strong belief that despite the communal violence that had already broken out across South Asia, there was a very strong belief that India and Pakistan would be very close friends after independence. There was a belief that these two countries would be a bit like New Zealand and Australia. They'd be separate entities, but they would get along fine. And there was also a belief, essentially, that the problems of communalism would be solved once Pakistan was created, once the country was partitioned, because the fundamental contradiction between Hindus and Sikhs on the one hand and Muslims on the other would have come to an end. There was also, incidentally and very importantly, a belief that there would be no large transfer of populations. This may seem very strange to us now. We can ask ourselves, how could Muslims in North India think that they could continue to remain in northern India? How could Sikhs and Hindus in Pakistan imagine that they could remain in Pakistan? But even at the very highest levels of policy, the belief was that there was no way that millions of people were going to leave their ancestral homelands and move to a wholly different country, right? The idea that Sikh peasants might give up their land, the land which had been held in their families for centuries, would give up their agricultural land and move to an urban space like Delhi was completely bizarre. As was the idea that the aristocratic Urdu-speaking elites of Delhi would basically suddenly move to rural Punjab, right? a lot of, as we know, the important sites of Sikhism would be located in what was going to become Pakistan. So the belief among both Indian and Pakistani policymakers was that there would be no large-scale exchange of populations. What this meant was that there were no preparations made for an exchange of populations. So in effect, the government of Pakistan, and I'm not just talking about the leadership, I'm not just talking about members of the Muslim League, I'm talking about people who are going to become civil servants, people who are going to head the various departments in Pakistan. In fact, those people were all sort of largely in Delhi, which had been, of course, their office until 1947. And a large number of people who would become the government of East Punjab, right? Again, civil servants, military personnel, telegraph personnel, railway personnel. They, along with their families, were spread in what the part of Punjab that was going to end up being in Pakistan. So there was no plan whatsoever by both the governments to make a transfer of population, because it was unthinkable. It was unthinkable that millions of people were going to leave their homes and go to another place altogether. But of course, that is precisely what ended up happening. And when it did ended up happening, what ended up, aeroplanes played a really, really important role in that story. You can see this image. You can see the wing of the aeroplane. It's partly there. You can see that huge numbers of people started leaving their homes to head for safety, whether it was Muslims from northern India or Sikhs and Hindus from sort of Pakistan. So what ended up happening was that aircraft suddenly became really important to shift the government officials of these two countries very quickly to their respective offices so that they could be in charge of the transfer of population. So in reality, one number for how many people moved from India to Pakistan, vice versa, is something like 14 million people. It's the second largest migration in South Asian history. The largest migration, of course, in South Asian history took place in 2014, when more than 14 million people probably moved during COVID. We can sort of discuss those numbers perhaps later. But the wider point is that out of those 14 million odd people who moved from India to Pakistan and vice versa, about 50,000 people maybe flew by aeroplanes. But the point is that these 50,000 people were incredibly important people. They were, they were civil servants, they were policemen, they were military personnel, telegraph personnel, railway personnel, along with their families. And those people were the people who organized the transfer of populations. Now, of course, partition was a very bloody and brutal affair. Hundreds of thousands of people may have died. But the fact that cholera didn't break out, the fact that you didn't have camps with mass disease and mass famine following this huge, unthinkable transfer of population owes at least something to aeroplanes, which were able to transfer the government officials to these two countries and also transfer very important things like medicine, like the cholera vaccine, from India to Pakistan at sort of a very rapid rate. All of this happened in the background of the splitting of the Indian Air Force. Now, the Indian Air Force, of course, was split between India and Pakistan. And I sort of signal to the wider story of here I signal to the wider story of Number 1 Squadron, which, as I mentioned, was the only squadron of the Indian Air Force for a very long time. So this Number 1 Squadron, it had a title, it had a sort of a motto, which was Ittihad mein Shakti hai, which translates roughly into there is strength in unity. Of course, as many of you are aware, Ittihad is an Urdu word. Shakti is a sort of Sanskritized Hindu word. This signaled the ruptures that had this signaled the unity after the ruptures that had previously sort of taken place in the Hindi-Urdu controversies that had happened in the 19th century. So the Number 1 Squadron really sort of tried to portray itself as an all India institution, as an institution that sort of had all varieties of Indians. But after independence, a couple of things happened to Number 1 Squadron. Because of the way that squadrons were allotted, Number 1 Squadron ended up being allotted to Pakistan. Pakistan didn't want to have this squadron, even though it's a sort of historically important squadron. So they abolished it on the sort of very first day, on 14th August 1947. Number 1 Squadron ceased to exist. But India re-raised Number 1 Squadron later on in the 1950s. However, when India re-raised the squadron, they changed the title from Ittihad mein Shakti hai to ekta mein shakti hai. So make of that what you will about the state of both India and Pakistan after independence. So that is effectively my second chapter. But moving on, of course, partition was followed very, very quickly by war in Kashmir. It's not a coincidence, but a lot of the first Indian soldiers to land in Kashmir were members of the Sikh regiment, who were basically um, sent straight from Gurgaon, where they were quelling partition riots, straight from Gurgaon in Delhi to Srinagar in Kashmir, to land at an airfield built by the Maharaja of Kashmir, Maharaja Hari Singh. I'm sure many of us present here are pretty familiar with this story, but just very, very quickly, what the Indians do is that they very, very quickly are able to mobilize a very large aerial flotilla to send troops to Kashmir, which is being attacked by tribesmen who are backed in turn by Pakistan over this sort of contested princely state. What you might find interesting about this image, if you look at the image in the background, where men are carrying some soldiers are carrying some luggage out of a small truck. You can see behind that truck there is an aeroplane. What's interesting about that aeroplane is that that is not an Indian Air Force aeroplane. That is an aeroplane of an Indian commercial company. So it is actually very highly likely, not highly likely, it's actually certain that India would not have been able to carry out the large movement of troops to Kashmir that it was able to without the commercial aircraft that were available. Again, many of the pilots of those aircraft were ex-Indian Air Force anyway. They had served in World War II. Now they were sort of serving in private companies. But interestingly, many of these pilots were also not Indian. There were quite a few British pilots. There were a couple of Australian pilots. There were a few Eastern European pilots who had sort of joined Indian airline companies, and they were all quite enthusiastic about flying into a war zone because, again, many of them had been pilots in World War II. So the idea of sort of flying into a war zone and leaving their boring scheduled flights behind was quite exciting to them. What I broadly talk about in this particular chapter, in addition to the Srinagar airlift, which of course was absolutely critical to drawing India's borders. If not for the Srinagar airlift, the map of South Asia now would be very, very different. What I talk about is also the extent to which aeroplanes played a very important role in de-escalation and escalation. Very shortly, let me explain that. So the war that took place in Kashmir was a limited war. Neither India nor Pakistan wanted an all-out war in the aftermath of partition. An all-out war, if it had happened, would almost certainly have resulted in the complete destruction of the economies of two very poor countries to begin with. It would also very likely have led to increased violence against the minorities, against Hindus in East Pakistan and against Muslims in India. So neither government wanted an all-out war. So they kind of tried to keep things limited. The Pakistanis kept things limited by pretending for the longest time that they were not engaged in Kashmir. And the Indians kept things limited by often not using the army, but using the Air Force, in places like Poonch, where for a very long time an air bridge was maintained in order to keep a surrounded garrison in Indian hands without escalating the conflict by sending the Indian army in larger numbers over there. Now the thing is that for a long time, using the Air Force instead of using the army helped keep escalation at a low point. But in due course, eventually it became escalatory in and of itself. Now, why am I talking about this at length? I'm talking about this at length because the big controversy about the Air Force and Kashmir is that if the Pakistanis had sort of used their Air Force and the Indian and Pakistani Air Forces had sort of shot each other in Kashmir, that would have sort of led to a wider war. Actually, my research shows that that's not likely. The Indian army and the Pakistani army were shooting at each other on the ground. That didn't lead to a wider war. So it's not likely that the air forces shooting at each other would have led to a wider war. But what did possibly lead to a wider war, especially in December 1948, was the increased anxieties in Pakistan about the use of aircraft, about how Indian aircraft was sort of being used to bomb important supply depots and so on. India did not see using aeroplanes as escalation. India saw using aeroplanes as an indirect mode of warfare, so therefore something that should not cause escalation. But for the Pakistanis, more and more, any kind of attacks from India was seen as escalation. So the bombing of this one particular supply depot at a place called Palak actually really played an important role in uh, a Pakistani retaliatory attack against Indian positions, which almost led to an all-out war. It's at this point in time that the Indian and Pakistani leaderships decided to kind of stop the fighting, because by this point things were going really out of control. So the argument which I make, which is a slightly complicated argument, but I'll just sort of restate it, is essentially that aeroplanes were initially seen as something that wasn't escalatory. Using aircraft for bombing and supplying places was seen as not escalatory by the Indians and Pakistanis. But as the war went on, it came to be seen more and more as a source of escalation. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if we want, but this is sort of an important point in the wider arguments that scholars have endlessly had over the last 70 years about the Air Force and war in Kashmir. The fourth chapter is a chapter which I talk about a very important and neglected story in the history of aviation, which is that if we think of aviation as a dyad with civil aviation and military aviation, in India we need to think of it as a triad. With the third end of the triangle being the princes, right? The Indian princes were very, very important, to the story of aviation in India. The first man in India to own an aeroplane was Maharaja Bhupinder Singh of Patiala. I'm sure many of you sort of know him. He's the inventor of both the Patiala shot and one of the key figures behind Patiala House. But the thing is that Bhupinder Singh is probably also the first Asian to own an aeroplane. He bought French aeroplanes as early as 1911. Now, much of the discourse around princes and airplanes in the literature on the Indian princes has been about how the princes, in fact, just bought aeroplanes because they were expensive and they were fast and they like luxury items. I'm trying to reverse that view. I'm trying to argue that actually the princes were very serious about using aeroplanes to claim that their states were modern. They were under attack on two sides. They were under attack on the one side by nationalists who said that the princes are Congress party was against the princes in very very significant parts of the party were against the princes. So they said the princes are outdated. We need to have popular democratic elections. The British attacked the princes by saying that Britain is the country that's bringing modernity to India. Britain is helping modernize and develop India. These princes are basically, anachronisms. They are leftovers of the past. Of course, it's a much more complicated relationship than that, but just very broadly for the princes, aeroplanes were an important source of legitimacy. You can see that from this image. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the man in the photo. This is Maharaja Umed Singh of Jodhpur, one of the most important figures in the history of aviation in India. If you look at these two images, you see the two avatars of the Indian king in the 1940s, right? On the one hand, you see the prince, the traditional sort of Rajput king who's wearing clothes which at least the British would consider to be traditional clothing, a traditional turban and wielding his sort of sword. But on the right, you can see the image of Maharaja Umed Singh as an air sort of air vice marshal of the Royal Air Force. He was incidentally a trained pilot. He had sort of he had gone to the Royal Air Force Academy. He had learned to fly aircraft. He was actually a pretty good pilot overall. And over here, you can see the Maharaja with his back sort of turned, looking at these various aeroplanes, that were flying from, his airfields in Jodhpur. Jodhpur becomes a really, really important place for aeroplanes because he builds a number of aerodromes so that aircraft passing from Karachi to Bombay and onward to Calcutta and onward from there to Southeast Asia and Australia, those aircraft can land in Jodhpur. This is at a time when aeroplanes don't fly quite as long as they do today. This is a time when you basically flew during the daylight hours. Your aeroplane would land in the evening. You'd get off in the evening, go to a hotel, have your dinner, go to sleep in the hotel, then wake up the next day and then fly again during the daylight hours. So Maharaja Umed Singh built important aerodromes in his state. He also asked the British for permission when World War II started. He asked the British for permission to fly into combat, to serve in a combat role, either in England or in India. The thing is that Maharaja Umed Singh's, predecessor, Sumer Singh, had led the charge of the Jodhpur Lancers at the Battle of Haifa in World War One. So he was trying to, in certain ways, catch up with his brother, fulfill the idea of, Rajput, sort of Rajput valor. But the British, of course, were not going to let him fly into battle. They didn't want him to, crash, or even worse, still be taken prisoner. And that was because Umed Singh was actually a very, very capable prince and administrator. He was somebody who had really fixed the chronic problems of his state. He had been quite important in very many ways to them. So he was too important to allow to fly. Nevertheless, during the war, he produced a very important report along with Hamidullah, the Nawab of Bhopal, on the Indian Air Force, which helped improve the conditions, the racism that Indian Air Force personnel were facing. So he's quite an important figure in that sense. And of course, the story of aviation continues with his son, Hanwant Singh, who will, go on to try and, establish Jodhpur as an independent state, who will get into negotiations to potentially consider not joining India. But the wider point is that their family had a very sort of strong link with aviation, and that link with aviation was not merely because they enjoyed flying fast, expensive planes. They saw aviation as a means of portraying kingship as a modern thing. They saw aviation as a means of legitimating their power. I don't only talk about Jodhpur. I also talk about about Hyderabad and about Mysore. Perhaps we can take questions about them later. I don't have much time to discuss it, but just very broadly, the princes played a really, really important role in the history of aviation in India. If you look at some of the most important airports in India, which are airports and air force stations in India, which are located outside the metro cities. The two important ones are Hyderabad and Hyderabad and Jodhpur, both of which were princely sort of aerodromes. And of course, Mysore is the site of Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. So it's not a coincidence that the princes played this very, very important role in promoting aviation. Of course, their princely order ended up being sort of wiped out by the coming of independence. But one of the key arguments which I make is that this was by no means a certainty in 1947. Again, a lot of scholars have argued that we might quite possibly have had some form of autonomous princely states within a wider union of India, or we might have had altogether independent states in and of themselves. So what we see in certain ways is a very important role played by the princes. My final chapter, I talk about a number of important things. One of those is, of course, the nationalization of aviation. Why in the 5 years after independence, aviation suddenly becomes an important thing. And the answer to that is, so far we've tended to talk about nationalization as a thing that the government of India did because of the lack of capability of private companies to run sort of air corporations. That is part of the story. It is true that at that point in time, throughout the world, governments, not just in India, but in France, in Britain, in the US, everywhere were nationalizing aircraft. So, the idea today, we think of privatization as a great thing, right? We think that privatization is the only way to go. Governments are fundamentally incapable of handling airlines. Well, in the 1950s, the belief was the opposite. The belief was that privatization had ruined airlines. The only thing that could successfully run an airline was a government. So much of the debate has been a debate about privatization and nationalization. But instead of focusing on privatization and nationalization, I'd like to point out the security aspects of having control of aviation. Right now, over the course of this talk, I've already spoken to you about how aeroplanes were really important during partition. They played a very important role in stabilizing a situation which might very well have gone out of control. The entirety of South Asia might have collapsed into a civil war. Aeroplanes were really, really important they were really important in the conflict around Kashmir. They were again very important in floods in places like Assam. And they were, of course, very important in 1950 when there was another clash between India and Pakistan. This time the clash didn't lead to war, but what it did lead to was that it led to Pakistan and India both basically investing heavily in air forces because it started an arms race between the two countries. So basically what ends up happening is that at this point in time, the government sees private ownership of aviation as private ownership of a national security resource, right? So it's not just so far whenever scholars have looked at the history of nationalization, they've looked at it mainly from an economic angle, and that's because we live in an age where money is considered to be the central concern of all the countries in the world. But actually, security is also a very important thing that was especially important in the 1950s. Just to give you a figure, if we look at the total number of aircraft in India in 1953, we're looking at about 75 to 80 civil aircraft, right? So that's not a whole lot. Currently we have considerably larger numbers of aircraft than that. So for the government, controlling the idea that civil and military aircraft are separate was not necessarily a very strong idea because civil aircraft had been used in so many crises. And the idea that civil aircraft needed to be controlled by the government so as to protect the country was a very important idea. Sure, there were economic concerns as well. The key economic idea being that India ought to basically be able to fund jet engines, which were going to be much more expensive, which private contractors couldn't possibly afford. But there's also a very strong economic rationale, right? So just very quickly, what are the big conclusions from my study? One is that aeroplanes were really important in shaping India's transformation from British colony to sovereign republic. Two is that the aviation as in general is reflective of the ways in which sovereignty was both constructed and contested. For Indian politicians well before independence, the idea was that if India was able to get its own aircraft, then it would be safe, it would be free, even if it remained within the British Empire. But if India did not have its own aviation, even if it exited the British Empire, it would still be dependent on Britain for security. It would be dependent on other countries. It would be vulnerable to invasion. The other thing is that both people who contested this Indian claim to a nation state also sort of invested heavily in aircraft. Pakistan invested quite heavily. Muhammad Ali Jinnah famously calls Mirza Isfahani and asks him to sort of set up an airline for Pakistan. The Pakistanis negotiated quite aggressively to ensure that they would be able to have a separate Pakistan Air Force. In fact, the decision to divide the armed forces was something that was also not a foregone conclusion. Most military experts felt that the armed forces ought to be kept unified at least for 5 years until after independence. But Liaquat Ali Khan famously said that Pakistan would be a house of cards if it didn't have its own military, and the air component of that was a very, very important component for the Pakistanis. The princes also tried to establish their own independent countries, or at least gain some level of autonomy by investing in aviation. So aviation was quite an important resource. I'm not trying to overstate its importance here, but just point to the fact that it's an important resource over which the various people who tried to create states in South Asia in the 1940s are having a contest. Finally, of course, India serves as a case study for the engagement of most countries in the world with aviation, right? If you look at aviation histories right now, most aviation histories, at least in the last, until about 5 years ago, were concentrated on a handful of countries. You've got America, France, Britain, Germany. At most, if you're looking at Asia, you perhaps add Japan. So the number of countries that histories of aviation have looked at so far has been very, very small. You can count them on the fingers of two hands. But the fact is that there are close to 200 countries in the world, and most of their experiences are much more similar to India than to the US or to France. Actually, looking at new histories that have come out, the history of aviation in Peru, the history of aviation in Egypt, we see a very remarkably similar story. We see the same kinds of attempts at independence, seeing airlines as a symbol of the country, Later on, attempts to privatize aircraft, attempts to indigenize aircraft production, and so on and so forth. So the story of India is actually much more representative of the story of the world than the story of any of the advanced, predominantly rich Western countries. So I will stop over there. Thank you. Just a quick piece of trivia: when the Maharaja was chosen as the icon for Air India, he was not in fact called the Maharaja. He was just a guy in a turban. The idea was to basically present a Darwan, but Indians associated aircraft so much with Maharajas that looking at this figure came to be known as the Maharaja. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal. It's a very interesting and very informative talk. And the way aviation developed and what was its effect on our history, it is a very interesting aspect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
I'm sure there must be some questions or comments. Any observations, comments, questions, clarification? Naren?
Okay, so I suppose we can call in early, and if if there are no further questions.
It's a totally new perspective that you have presented. How the history of aviation and the history of the country were sort of intermixed, and how they affected each other. It's very interesting.
Yes, thank you, sir.
Narendra?
I believe a few people have questions.
What happened? I see. Unmute करो अपना mic. I see अपना unmute करो, mic unmute करो.
I think I've been unmuted, so I can now. I think there's some problem.
Hello.
Controls. Just one second. May I finish?
Narendra.
No, Dr. Iqbal, I just wanted to know this Air India, was it constituted by the Tatas through private investment? Did they buy the aircraft? What is the story of Air India? How did it?
So basically, the Tatas had their own airline. It was initially called Tata Air Sons and then Tata Airlines. They subsequently renamed it as Air India, but in 1947, they contacted the government to establish what they would call Air India International. Now, this is an example of what I guess we now call public-private partnerships, right? Where basically the Tatas were quite keen on getting the money of the government because they couldn't really afford to buy these new, larger aircraft. So they basically reached out to the government to get money to buy a couple of Constellations that would be Constellation aircraft that would be able to fly to London. The Indian government, incidentally, was caught unprepared. Basically, there was no plan to start an international airline. Again, as you can imagine, there were other things on their plate. So later on, when they asked, so the clearances for the airline went through very quickly. With the government of India owning a large stake in the airline and the company owning a smaller stake in the airline, but having management rights. So basically, the airline would be under management of the Tatas, but the bulk of the money would come from the government of India. What was interesting about this is that later on, Jagjeevan Ram, who would later serve as the Minister of Communications and Air, he later said, "We didn't know what we were doing when we signed those clearances." We didn't.
अब
Yeah,
अब
so-
हुआ, हाँ, ठीक।
So we didn't know what we were doing, which is why we gave them such quick clearances. But Air India International, of course, was a huge success and subsequently remained a separate corporation even after nationalization. So that's the story. They initially didn't want to. The British were not initially very keen on giving Air India International the landing rights at Heathrow. Heathrow is their main airport in London. They wanted it to go to a secondary airport over there. But then the JRD Tata was able to quite successfully argue with them and get the rights to land at Heathrow, and services for Air India was subsequently started quite quickly to Britain. There's a larger story which maybe we can talk about later, which is about why it is that suddenly bilateral airlines became a thing, because after the Second World War, initially the plan was to establish an international airline in which all countries would be part, like the United Nations. But that didn't end up happening for us because of a clash between Britain and the United Kingdom. Maybe we can talk about that later, but perhaps we'll take some other questions for now.
I see.
Hello.
Hello, sir.
Unmute karo, unmute.
And you know, talk was very interesting, very absorbing, and thought-provoking also. Can you kindly repeat, enlighten us about the Kashmir situation when our
Yes, sir.
Air Force landed one or two planes and Parja was persuaded and the tribes were coming.
Yes, sir.
You probably said that both countries wanted to avoid full-scale
Yes, sir.
air warfare.
Yes, sir.
Yes, that was your conclusion. But your voice was so low,
Right.
I could not probably catch.
Okay, so I'm sorry about the audio, but just very broadly, so there are two components to this. One is that India and Pakistan didn't want an all-out general war, right? Because the thing was that the Pakistanis had logistical superiority in Kashmir, in the sense that all the roads from Punjab were located in Pakistan. So it was much harder for India to get supplies into Kashmir. India could only get supplies through the Banihal Pass, which is snowed out for much of the year. So if there was a war, India would not attack. If there was an all-out war, India would not attack Kashmir. India would have to attack Punjab, because our military would be able to move straight through the plains of Punjab into the heart of Pakistan. That in turn would have had huge economic, social, and international consequences that were not acceptable to the Indian leadership, and ideally would not be acceptable to the Pakistani leadership as well. So that's the general war which India and Pakistan were trying to avoid. Now, one of the ways they tried to avoid this war was by not flying their aircraft against each other. So the Pakistani Air Force was not used against the Indian Air Force, even though the Pakistan Air Force did serve in Kashmir. So the Pakistanis mainly used transport aircraft to supply their troops and their militias in Kashmir. Now the thing is that a lot of the literature around the war in Kashmir, around the air war in Kashmir, has been about how if India had shot down a Pakistani aeroplane, or if the Pakistanis had attacked Indian aeroplanes with their aeroplanes, that would have led to a general war. But the fact of the matter is that that would not have led to a general war, because the Indian army and the Pakistani army were by July 1948 already in a full scale, already in a limited conflict against each other in Kashmir itself. But what instead I argue is that as the war went on, the threshold of Pakistani acceptance of Indian actions became more and more reduced, because the Pakistanis were convinced as the conflict went on that India was looking not just to conquer Kashmir, but to annihilate Pakistan altogether by pushing a very large number of refugees into Pakistan and overwhelming the Pakistani economy. So they basically mobilized their military to attack India. And when the Indian Air Force bombed a place called Palak, that led to a response, a huge shelling by the Pakistanis, which in turn may have led to a general war, because it was such a large scale sort of artillery assault, lasting over 24 hours, that it may have led to a full scale war, which is one of the reasons why the Indian and Pakistani leaderships decided suddenly in December 1948 to basically call an end to hostilities, because the situation was spiraling out, and even the old modes of controlling the conflict, of using proxies or using aircraft, were becoming increasingly hard to maintain for both countries. Again, this is a slightly complicated argument, but it's better presented in the book than perhaps I have presented orally.
Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
And there,
Hey, very interesting talk. In fact, part of it we knew and part of it we learned. And I should congratulate the author. I'll have to pick up the book and
Please
read
do,
it
sir.
in
Please
greater
do.
detail. Maybe he will hear from you at a later point. Great.
Manavji,
Yes, thank you, sir. Dr. Iqbal, just one thing when you, there's a new idea, and I think it was interesting to know from you what are the various facets of this issue. There's one thing which comes to our mind is if India was not as developed in this aeroplane industry with the
Yeah.
aeroplane things, what you have mentioned that it has been very central to the achievement of independence by India. You have mentioned in one of the conclusions there. So, does it mean that if Indian airplane industry was not as developed, or that it was not as whatever it was, if it was not there, say,
Yeah.
would we not have achieved independence, or would the independence have been delayed by some years?
It would have been formal independence, sir. But as you know, formal independence and substantive independence are not the same thing. So we could have been formally independent from the British, but then we would either be reliant on them or the US or the Russians. We would be reliant on some other country to meet our airspace defense needs. And that in turn is not true independence, because then if you are reliant on another country to defend your airspace, you are not an independent country. So that was the big concern of a lot of Indian politicians, that even if we didn't receive, even if the British didn't call it independence, if we had our own air force, we would be independent. But if the British called it independence and didn't give us an air force, or didn't allow us to have our own air force, then that would not be independence. Independence would not have been delayed because basically the British had made the decision by 1946 to quit India. The only question was, whether the independence could be formally maintained, and Mountbatten was deeply concerned. I've gone through his papers. His staff was very deeply concerned that India would not have any kind of defense, especially against atomic bombardment. The big belief was that India would fight against the USSR, right? That India would be an ally with the British and would fight against the USSR, but the USSR had, atom bombs. Of course, the thing is that India and Pakistan got their own conflict going, and Indians ended up actually being friends with the USSR. So that calculation was completely mistaken on the part of the British.
No, in that sense, even today,
Yeah.
most of the countries are interdependent. So to say
Correct.
that any country, even today, when we are dependent on many things on other countries, same as the other
Sure.
countries are dependent on us. So maybe interdependence is becoming more and more now than what probably was at that point of time. Maybe.
Sure, sir. Sure. Especially because of decolonization, there was a strong belief that you needed to be independent
Okay,
in
thank
everything.
you. Thank
Okay,
you.
sir.
Arun,
yes.
just one
Sub-
question came to mind.
Yes.
Mr. Iqbal, Professor Iqbal, you
Yes, sir.
mentioned Air Marshal Engineer.
Yes.
You did not mention Air Marshal Subrata Mukherjee, who was the
Yes.
first Indian Chief of the Air Force. Any
Yes.
particular reason?
No, sir. The reason was because I presume that this gathering is well aware of Subrata Mukherjee and his achievements.
Because of the
I
football?
was mentioning more obscure persons who perhaps have not received that much attention. But Subrata Mukherjee, of course, is a very critical person, not least because of his identity. So the earlier idea was that only martial races were capable of serving in the military. And this was a deeply unpopular idea among Indian nationalists because it meant that precisely those classes of people who were against the British, who were independently minded, were not going to be represented in the armed forces. So what ends up happening is that the fact that this particular wing of the military not only ends up having members of people belonging to effeminate classes, but indeed ends up being led by a Bengali, who has again, to rise in the Air Force, you need to have a record that is not only administrative but also technical, right? The whole point of air warfare is that it's highly sort of it's a highly technical, highly scientific form of conflict. So Subrata Mukherjee's sort of emergence as a leader in that field in certain ways shatters the myth of the martial races. So he's quite important in that way. Of course, he is the first commander of the Indian squadron. He has the thing of being. He's the first commander of of a flight of Indian aircraft, first commander of a squadron of Indian aeroplanes, and then first commander of the Indian Air Force overall. So he's kind of a towering
The
figure
father,
in this.
yeah. Because you may,
Sure.
by the short
Mahavaji?
talk of yours, no, the talk of yours, you may have enjoyed, annoyed a number of Bengalis across the country. I should hope not.
No, I'm praising the Bengalis here.
No, no.
I mean, they have they historically conquered India for the British, right? Like the Bengal army was the linchpin of imperial expansion in India. So yes.
Mahavaji, आपको कुछ
I think,
नरेंद्र?
no, sir, I think Kumaut Saab wanted to.
हाँ, कौन समझ में पूछ रहा हूँ तो कुछ अनम्यूट कर दीजिए. Yes.
I congratulate Professor Iqbal
Thank you, sir.
for an excellent presentation. My simple question is, what was the route from India to London when commercial flights begin in 1947 or at that time? Was it not from Jodhpur that the last
Yes, sir.
airport was Jodhpur? Because in Umaid Heritage,
Yes,
Umaid
sir.
Palace in Jodhpur, there is a museum also.
Yes, sir.
I mentioned that flights used to go from Jodhpur to Karachi.
Yes, sir.
And what are other airports which it used to touch?
Yes, sir. So you're absolutely right. So the journey from India to London today, you can probably, I think it's 20 hours or something, 10 hours. I think it's a 10 hour.
10 hours.
9 hours,
10
9 hours.
Yeah. So it was 10 days. 10 days at that time. You couldn't fly in the night. You couldn't fly the whole day. So what you did was you started from Calcutta, you flew to Lucknow, then you flew to Delhi, then from Delhi to Jodhpur, Jodhpur to Karachi, Karachi to Aden, Aden to Cairo, Cairo across to Italy, then from Rome, you would fly to Frankfurt, Frankfurt to Paris, and then to London. Of course, there were different routes, but basically every day you flew to a different city, and then it was a very elite aristocratic pastime, right? There were no low budget travel at that point. So basically, coolies came onto you in Jodhpur. You'd get off. Coolies would come and take your luggage to the 5-star hotel, which you'd stay in, which would be right next to the aerodrome. And then you'd sort of have your dinner, stay the night, wake up the next day, leave at around 11, fly till around 5 in the evening, to Karachi, get off over there, go to the club, and so on. So it was quite a long route, and absolutely, Umaid, the important thing I'm trying to say about Jodhpur is that Jodhpur, which is a semi-independent princely state, and not even one of the larger princely states, at least in comparison to some of the huge ones, becomes really important because it's able to place itself alongside other cities. It's able to place itself alongside Rome and Cairo by being on this aerial network, right? And this is not just a question of prestige. It's also a very pretty clear financial issue, right? Like Jodhpur historically did not have a lot of agriculture because of its relative aridity. So most of its money comes from things like excise taxes, and having aeroplanes pass through it, aeroplanes that are paying to pass through it at the peak of the Great Depression, is an important source of revenue for a princely state. So it's quite important in that sense. So you're absolutely right.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, sir.
I just want to mention some anecdotal evidence which will support
Please,
this.
please.
I mentioned to you that I was born in Jodhpur and grew up for a few years there.
Right.
And I distinctly remember the crash and the importance of aerodrome, because there were a lot of people there and we had good social relations with them. Jodhpur residents always considered themselves kind of superior to Jaipur residents.
Yes.
The feeling was that, it's a much more modern city. And
Yes.
that was essentially because there was civil aviation in Jodhpur. The
Yeah.
aerodrome was very important. Elite traveled to Jodhpur from Karachi or Bombay.
Yeah.
And they
Yeah.
stayed the night there. They were much
Yep.
more fashionable people. They were close to the British. They spoke very good English.
Yes.
So Jodhpur residents used to consider themselves very superior. And when Jaipur was made the capital of Rajasthan,
Yes.
they were very upset about it.
Yes,
That,
sir.
we are a much more modern city.
Yes.
So, this is what I learned as a child there. And I suppose there is some truth to it because of the
I
fact
was at my friend's wedding in Jodhpur in 2000, I'm going to say 18, and the bride was from Jaipur. So much of this discourse about the Jodhpur Jaipur rivalry was still exists.
Wow.
And of course, the fact of the matter is that Maharaja Umaid Singh is trying to differentiate himself in a wider context of like royal tradition in Rajasthan, right? I mean, there are about 12 or 15 other kings, all of whom sort of are from the same region. So this is a very important way of distinguishing himself from from the other monarchs with whom he, of course, has relationships of rivalry and alliance from time to time.
Any other observation? We had very interesting discussion, followed by a very interesting talk. Banawatji?
Yes, sir.
Formally thank you.
Firstly, because I was not able to hear the entire audio because of low audio quality, but still, whatever I could gather, I'll not venture to summarize what has been said because everybody has heard it. So, on behalf of everyone who has been listening to you, Dr. Iqbal, thanks a lot that you have now opened a new vista, new dimension of this developmental journey of India. I mean, I think maybe the next volume when you bring out a new book, even now afterwards, say how has the country's development been parallel to the country of the airline industry in India? Maybe it could be. You are right, and there are many people who say that the development of an economy of a country runs parallel to many things, and
Yes,
one
sir.
of them is the air sector. And
Yes, sir.
maybe we are growing fast in this now. So maybe you will also now, in the maybe next talk when we have, you'll also let us know this is a pre-independent, independent. Maybe you might make another presentation. And we are seeing it that any country is developed faster, and now the Indian industry is growing at a very fast pace in the airspace also. So thank you very much on behalf of all of us. It was a very illuminating talk, very informative, a new area, and you accepted our invitation to talk to us on this topic. So thank you all very much. Those who are listening to you, all thanks to them also, and particularly a big vote of thanks to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you also. Please buy my book.
Thank you.
Suggest it to your libraries.
Yes.
Yes,
Spread the
thank
word
you.
as far as you
Of
can.
course.
And
Thank
thank you,
you,
Mr.
Dr.
Kumar.
Iqbal.
Thank you, Mr. Narendra. Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you
you so
very
much,
much.
sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.